What's up? I'm Coach Dan Blewett. I'm a former pro pitcher. In today's video, let's talk about, is a slider or curveball safer and which one is right for you? All right, so if you're new here, check out my books, my online throwing programs. If you want to learn to be a better pitcher, if you're a coach and you want to better help coach your players, you'll find tons of resources, free and paid, in my description below. So curveballs versus sliders, which ones are safer, which ones are easier, which ones are right for different types of pitchers? First thing, spoiler alert. Neither are safe. Neither one is safer than the other. Curveballs are not good for your arm. Sliders are not good for your arm. Fastballs are also not good for your arm. The pitching research is pretty clear. Fastballs are the most stressful pitch in baseball. Sliders, curveballs, and changeups are less stressful. Changeups appear to be the least stressful of all the pitches. Now, one of the things to consider when throwing a curveball or a slider is the release is very different than a fastball. On a fastball, you're releasing it here, and then you're immediately pronating on the inside. So the pronator flexors, these muscles in your forearm, they're more active on a fastball or a changeup because you're turning on the inside of the pitch at release. When they're firing, they're helping to protect and take away, attenuate the stress that goes through your ulnar collateral ligament, which is the Tommy John ligament. And you'll see here, there's my scar. When you throw a slider, curveball, or cutter, you're supinating that pitch. You're out here somewhere. You're not pronated. You're supinated to a degree, which means the supinating muscles, the supinator is the main one, that is forcing your pronator flexor mass to be slightly more relaxed. Less of these are firing because you're supinated. It's called reciprocal inhibition. If you're supinating, the muscles that pronate have to relax. So that just means these muscles that protect your UCL are less active when you're throwing a slider or a curveball. Am I saying that's the reason that it's going to hurt your arm or the reason that they're less safe? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that's the mechanics and some of the physiology behind throwing those pitches. So when people say cutters, sliders, curveballs aren't as good for your arm, that's one of the arguments for why they're not. Now, which pitch, a slider or a curveball, is better for you? This is really dependent on two big things. Number one, your arm slot. If you're a low arm slot player, whether you're three-quarter or low three-quarter, a slider is probably going to be a lot easier for you to get good movement on, and a curveball is not going to be appropriate because you're not going to be able to get on top of the pitch as well and produce the 12-6 spin from an arm slot that's pretty low. If you're a higher arm slot player, somewhere up here, you can throw a slider just fine, you can throw a curveball just fine, so it's completely up to you. The thing to consider is that most pitchers in pro ball and college ball throw sliders. And the reason is that most of those pitchers learned curveballs when they were young. Curveball's typically the first breaking ball a coach will teach a young pitcher. But then if you say, okay, well, if almost everyone learns a curveball first, but then only maybe 40% of pitchers or 30% of pitchers throw a curveball in college or pro ball, where did all those curveballs go? That's because they learned a curveball first, but then when they got to higher levels of baseball, they figured out that they weren't that good of a pitch, that they weren't good enough to get varsity hitters out, or they were good enough to get varsity hitters out, but when they got to college, they weren't good enough to get those hitters out. And then that pitch got scrapped or became the fourth best pitch or the third best pitch, and coach taught them a slider, which became a better pitch than their curveball. That's the typical progression that you see. You don't see a lot of tremendously sharp, great curveballs in pro baseball anymore or college baseball. It's a hard pitch to throw that well and that sharp to get that caliber of hitter out. So that's something to consider, that I believe firmly that the learning curve on the slider to have a competent varsity slider or a competent D3 slider or a competent D1 slider or a competent pro slider, I believe it's easier to develop that than to have a competent varsity D1 pro curveball. Take that for what you will, but I do think the slider has proven itself to be an easier pitch to learn and an easier pitch to develop into a really high caliber pitch. There are, of course, some pros and cons to each. If you throw a really bad curveball where it kind of hardly breaks and is just flat and junky, it's typically going to come in around neck high on the hitter, and they're not going to really be able to get to it that well. When pitchers get in trouble throwing bad curveballs, it's when they throw a decent breaking curveball. It still breaks, but they throw it so it breaks to the middle of the zone. That's what we typically think of as a hanging curveball, even though I would say a hanging curveball is the really crappy one that floats up by the player's throat. So this is just to say that a curveball, when thrown poorly, can be sometimes a little more forgiving because bad curveballs are typically bounced in the dirt or they're thrown so high that the hitter can't do a lot with it. And then the decent breaking ones end up in the strike zone or just below it. With sliders, when you throw a bad breaking slider, sure, you can throw them up and out of the zone and not real swingable, but lots of times You'll throw one that tracks for the middle and it'll just become what we call a cement mixer, where it spins but it doesn't break, and that becomes like a batting practice fastball. So say you throw 80 and you throw a slider, which is typically 72, which is about normal. Sliders are about 10% slower than fastballs. Curveballs are about 15% slower, which is a pretty big, up to 20%, which is a big speed difference. If you throw a 72, 73 mile per hour cement mixer off of an 80 mile per hour fastball, a hitter's gonna probably smash that. And you see that quite a lot. Sliders are a little less forgiving when you throw a bad one in the middle of the zone compared to a curveball. That's my opinion. You can reject that if you want, but I've kind of experienced that and I believe that to be true. Does that mean you should pick a curveball over a slider for that reason? No, that's just one of the pros and cons in this bucket. But overall, when we're trying to decide which pitch you should learn first, it's really just going to come down to personal preference. Which one are you excited to learn as a pitcher? Do you really want to throw a curveball because you love Clayton Kershaw and Adam Wainwright's one of your heroes and you want to throw one like him? Then go do it. That's exciting. I think a slider is probably an easier pitch to learn. And I personally don't think players should be learning a curveball or slider until their 14U summer. I wouldn't recommend 10-year-olds or 11-year-olds throwing curveballs or sliders anyway. But when it does come time, I really think it's a personal preference. I think the arm slot thing is the biggest first indicator. So you get a lower arm slot kid, teach him a slider, don't bother with a curveball. If you have a higher arm slot kid, you know, they can make that choice and you can talk about the pros and cons, show them this video, whatever it is. But ultimately you need a tinker, because I've had players, when I've taught them a curveball, they throw a nasty curveball pretty quick, and their slider, they just like can't get the spin down because they're very different. I've had the opposite be true as well, where players just cannot figure out how to throw a good curveball, and then you teach them a good slider, and it's like pretty darn good within a couple weeks and a month, and they're excited about it, and they're very motivated. So it's just a different, you're spinning both pitches pretty differently, and I won't go into that. I'll link below to some of my tutorials on the slider and the curveball. But ultimately, you just have to give both of them a try. Give them a 1 to 2 month trial period, throwing to someone who can give you good feedback, whether that's a coach or a catcher who really knows what they look like. You need feedback to say, hey, it looks like your curveball is really developing, but your slider just like isn't really getting there. Maybe we should scrap the slider and go full time into the curveball. That's the conversation and what we would do when I was teaching players and trying to figure out which one is going to be a better fit for this young man or young woman, which one's going to be a better fit for them. We just try both. I would gauge the spin. I'd be like, hey, it's been a month. Your slider still stinks, but I'm starting to see some real good spin on your curveball. I think we should go with that one. How do you feel about it? It's your career, not mine. So what do you think? That's kind of my approach to it. And I think that's a pretty diplomatic, reasonable way to go about it, because you never know. But tinkering with both, giving it a trial run, and then ultimately determine which one you want to stick with. You absolutely do not need both pitches, especially as an amateur. You absolutely should not throw a curveball and a slider. You should have a fastball, one of those two breaking balls, and a changeup. That's the repertoire that will take you all the way into pro baseball. You don't need two breaking balls. There's not a good use case for both. One's going to be way better than the other. And in amateur levels of baseball, just throw the better quality one. It's not going to be specific enough where you're going to need to throw a slider into this guy and then a curveball. It's just whatever pitch is sharper and better, that's the one you go with. And that's all you really need to know. So hopefully this video was helpful. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, share this with a friend, and I'll see you here in the next video.